There is something very strange about being alone. Most people are afraid of it. The moment they find themselves alone, they reach for their phone. They turn on Netflix. They text somebody. They go somewhere where there are other people because being alone forces you to hear yourself. And a lot of people don't like what they hear. They don't like their thoughts. They don't like their insecurities. They don't like the questions that suddenly appear when there is nobody around to distract them. Who am I actually? What do I really want? Why am I unhappy? Why am I constantly trying to impress other people? And that's why solitude can be so uncomfortable. But there's another side to it. If you can learn to be alone without feeling empty, something very important begins to happen. You start developing parts of yourself that other people never develop. Because when you're constantly surrounded by people, you're constantly receiving signals from them. What should I wear? What should I say? What should I believe? What's popular? What does everybody else think? And without realizing it, you begin building your identity from other people's reactions. You become a reflection. You laugh because everyone else is laughing. You want something because everyone else seems to want it. You believe something because everybody around you believes it. And then one day you're completely surrounded by people and you have absolutely no idea who you are when they're gone. That's the danger. Being alone isn't necessarily loneliness. Loneliness is when you desperately want connection and can't find it. Solitude is different. Solitude is when you don't need somebody else to constantly validate your existence. You can sit by yourself, you can think, you can read, you can work, you can walk, you can create something, and you don't feel like something is missing. That's a tremendous psychological strength because if you cannot tolerate your own company, you become dependent on other people's company, and dependence makes you vulnerable. Think about relationships. If you're terrified of being alone, what happens when somebody treats you badly? You tolerate things you shouldn't tolerate. You forgive things you shouldn't forgive. You become afraid to walk away, not because the relationship is good, but because the alternative scares you. Being alone, and that's where solitude gives you power. When you know you can survive alone, you can finally choose people instead of needing people. That's a completely different position. You don't say, I need you because I can't live without you. You say, I want you in my life because you make my life better. There's enormous freedom in that difference. And I think this is one of the reasons why periods of solitude have played such an important role in the lives of creative people, writers, artists, thinkers, inventors. People who created something different usually had moments where they stepped away from the crowd because originality requires distance. If you're constantly listening to everybody else, how are you going to hear your own voice? You can't. You need silence. You need boredom. You need moments where nothing is happening because that's when your mind starts making connections. You remember something from 10 years ago, you connect it with something that happened yesterday. You suddenly understand why a relationship failed. You realize that you've been chasing the wrong goal. You discover an idea that you couldn't see when your mind was constantly being bombarded by information. That's one of the great benefits of solitude. It gives your mind room, and modern life is doing everything possible to take that room away. Look at what happens the moment you're waiting somewhere. You reach for your phone, waiting for an elevator. Phone, sitting in a restaurant. Phone, walking down the street. Phone, lying in bed. Phone. Even when there is nothing wrong, we feel uncomfortable with silence. Why? Because silence gives your thoughts a chance to catch up with you. And sometimes that's exactly what you need. You need to discover what you've been avoiding. There's a difference between distraction and peace. Distraction makes you forget yourself. Solitude helps you understand yourself. And if you spend enough time alone, you begin noticing something else. You become less impressed by the crowd. You start questioning things. You stop automatically accepting the opinions of other people. You become capable of saying, everybody seems to believe this, but do I? That's where independent thinking begins. And independent thinking is rare. Most people don't actually form their opinions, they inherit them from their parents, from their friends, from their culture, from social media, from whatever group they desperately want to belong to. and belonging is powerful. Human beings are social animals. We want acceptance. We want approval. We want to feel like we're part of something. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem begins when belonging becomes more important than truth, because then you'll sacrifice your own judgment just to remain accepted. You'll laugh at jokes you don't find funny. You'll defend people you don't respect. You'll pretend to like things you don't like. You'll even change your personality depending on who you're standing next to. And after doing this for years, you can lose contact with yourself. Solitude interrupts that process. When you're alone, there is nobody to perform for, nobody to impress, nobody to convince. And that's when you can finally ask the uncomfortable question, what do I actually think? Not what your friends think, not what your followers think, not what your family expects. What do you think? That question can change your life. But there's another reason solitude is so powerful. It teaches you emotional independence. You begin realizing that every emotion doesn't require an immediate reaction. You're angry, you don't have to call somebody. You're anxious, you don't have to immediately distract yourself. You're bored, you don't have to open an app. You can sit with the feeling, watch it, understand it, and eventually it passes. That's emotional strength. Because one of the biggest weaknesses a person can have is being controlled by whatever they feel in the moment. Angry, they send the message. Lonely, they contact the wrong person. Insecure, they seek validation. Bored, they consume something. Rejected, they chase. But solitude teaches you to pause. And that pause is incredibly valuable because between an emotion and an action, there is a space. The stronger you become, the larger that space becomes. And inside that space, you regain control. You can decide what to do instead of simply reacting. That's why being comfortable alone can make you more socially powerful as well. It sounds like a contradiction, but it's true. When you don't desperately need approval, people feel it. You're calmer. You don't talk just to fill silence. You don't laugh at everything. You don't desperately explain yourself. You don't chase people who clearly aren't interested. You don't need to prove that you're important. And ironically, that can make other people more interested in you because you're no longer asking, do you like me? You're asking, do I like you? That's a completely different psychological position, and you can see it everywhere. The person who desperately wants to be accepted often becomes the least interesting person in the room. They're constantly adjusting themselves. But the person who is comfortable with himself can sit quietly. He can listen. He can observe. He doesn't need to dominate the conversation. He doesn't need everyone to agree with him. There is a kind of inner gravity there, and that gravity comes from having a relationship with yourself. Now, I'm not saying you should isolate yourself. That's a completely different thing. Isolation can become destructive. Human beings need relationships. You need friends. You need love. You need people who challenge you. You need people who care about you. You cannot develop everything by yourself, but there is a difference between needing connection and being unable to function without constant connection. That's the distinction. You should be able to move between solitude and society. You can spend a day alone and be perfectly comfortable. Then you can walk into a room full of people and connect with them. That's strength. You can go inward and then come back outward. You don't build a fortress around yourself. You build a center inside yourself. And when you have that center, other people's opinions become information rather than commands. Someone criticizes you, you listen. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but you don't immediately collapse. Someone praises you, you appreciate it, but you don't suddenly believe you're extraordinary. Someone rejects you, it hurts. Of course, it hurts. You're human, but you don't conclude, I'm worthless, because your entire sense of identity isn't dependent on that person's opinion. That's what solitude can build, a stable relationship with yourself. And perhaps the most important thing it builds is creativity. Because creativity requires you to tolerate emptiness. You sit there, nothing happens, you have no idea, you feel stupid, you want to quit. And then suddenly something appears, an idea, a connection, a possibility. But if you can't tolerate those 10 minutes of silence, you'll never reach it. You'll constantly consume instead of create. You'll watch instead of build. You'll react instead of think. And eventually, your entire life becomes a response to what other people are doing. That's why I think you should deliberately create periods of solitude, not because people are bad, not because society is evil, but because you need to hear your own mind. Take a walk without your phone, sit somewhere without music, read something difficult, write down what you're actually thinking, spend an evening alone without immediately filling the silence. And at first, it may feel uncomfortable. Good, pay attention to that discomfort because you're discovering how dependent you've become on stimulation. Then something changes. The silence becomes less threatening. Your thoughts become clearer. You start remembering what you wanted before everyone else started telling you what you should want. And slowly, you begin becoming your own person. That's the real gift of solitude. It doesn't necessarily make you less social. It can make your relationships better because you stop using people to escape yourself. You stop demanding that another person complete you. You stop turning relationships into emotional survival. Instead, you bring something to the relationship, your own ideas, your own purpose, your own standards, your own life. And that's when connection becomes healthier. Two people who can stand alone can actually choose to stand together. That's much stronger than two people desperately holding on to each other because they're afraid of falling. So if you're alone right now, don't automatically assume something is wrong with you. Maybe this period has something to teach you. Maybe you're being forced to discover what you actually value. Maybe you're learning that you don't need to chase everyone who walks away. Maybe you're discovering that your attention is valuable. Maybe you're finally hearing an idea that was buried underneath all the noise. And maybe the person you're becoming in solitude is someone you could never have become in the crowd, because the crowd can teach you how to fit in, but solitude can teach you who you are. And once you know who you are, you can walk back into the world without needing the world to tell you who to be. When you spend enough time alone, something strange begins to happen. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop checking whether people approve of you. And most importantly, you begin to hear your own thoughts without the noise of other people drowning them out. Most people are uncomfortable with silence because silence exposes them. It forces you to confront the questions you've been avoiding. What do I actually want? Why am I chasing this? Why do I need this person's attention? Why does their opinion affect me so much? When you're constantly surrounded by people, it's easy to mistake social stimulation for happiness. You have conversations, you receive notifications, you make plans, you laugh, you stay busy. But being busy isn't the same thing as being fulfilled. And this is where solitude becomes powerful. Because when the distractions disappear, your weaknesses become visible, your insecurities become visible, your dependencies become visible. And if you're willing to sit with them instead of running away, you begin to develop something most people never develop: self command. You no longer need someone else to tell you that you're valuable. You know it. You no longer need someone else to give you direction. You create it. And you no longer panic when someone walks away because you've learned something incredibly important. You can survive your own company. That's a form of power. Think about the people who are terrified of being alone. They tolerate disrespect just to keep someone around. They stay in relationships they know are destroying them. They constantly chase friendships' attention, validation, and approval, not because those people are truly valuable, but because being alone feels worse. And that creates weakness. Because the person who is terrified of losing you can be controlled by you. But the person who is comfortable walking away, that's different. They negotiate differently. They love differently. They speak differently. They carry themselves differently because underneath everything is the quiet belief, I don't need you to complete me. And ironically, this often makes people more interested in you because desperation repels, independence attracts. When you don't desperately seek attention, your attention becomes more valuable. When you don't constantly explain yourself, your words carry more weight. When you're comfortable sitting alone, people begin to wonder what exists inside that silence. And that's another thing: solitude develops mystery. You don't reveal every thought, you don't announce every plan, you don't need to broadcast every achievement. You learn to keep certain parts of yourself private. And in a world where everyone is constantly performing for attention, privacy becomes rare. But there's an even deeper benefit. Solitude gives you the space to build. While everyone else is consuming, you can create. While everyone else is reacting, you can think. While everyone else is chasing trends, you can develop your own direction. This is why some of the most powerful periods of your life may look completely unremarkable from the outside. No applause, no recognition, no crowd. Just you working, thinking, learning, and becoming someone different. At first, it can feel like you're being left behind, but sometimes you're not being left behind. You're being separated from the noise so you can build something the crowd cannot give you. And eventually, you return to society differently. You don't enter the room looking for approval. You enter knowing who you are. You don't speak because you need attention. You speak because you have something worth saying. You don't chase people who withdraw. You observe. You don't fear rejection. You understand that rejection is information, and you don't fear being alone anymore because you've discovered that solitude wasn't punishment. It was training. There comes a point where solitude stops feeling like loneliness. It starts feeling like freedom. You realize you can wake up without checking who texted you. You can spend an entire evening without needing anyone's attention. You can make a decision without asking 10 people whether it's the right one. And slowly, you develop something extremely rare, an internal source of validation. Most people live from the outside in. They look at other people's reactions and then decide how they should feel about themselves. If people praise them, they feel powerful. If people criticize them, they collapse. If someone leaves them, they question their worth. But solitude teaches you to live from the inside out. You decide who you are first. Then you allow the world to react. That distinction changes everything. Because once you stop depending on other people's reactions, manipulation becomes much harder. Someone can insult you and you don't immediately become defensive. Someone can ignore you and you don't desperately chase them. Someone can reject you and you don't turn the rejection into a judgment about your identity. You simply observe it, you learn from it, and you continue. This is emotional independence. And emotional independence is one of the greatest forms of freedom a person can develop. But there is a warning here. Solitude is powerful only when you're actually using it to grow. There is a difference between being alone and isolating yourself. Isolation comes from fear. Solitude comes from choice. Isolation says, people are terrible. I don't need anyone. Solitude says, I enjoy people, but I don't need constant access to them. One is bitterness. The other is strength. You still build relationships. You still connect. You still love. You still participate in the world, but you are no longer psychologically dependent on it. And that's when relationships become healthier because you aren't approaching people from desperation. You're approaching them from abundance. You don't ask, what can this person give me? You begin asking, what kind of person do I become around them? That's a much more powerful question because the wrong people can slowly destroy your identity. They can make you doubt yourself. They can normalize disrespect. They can convince you that your boundaries are unreasonable. And if you're constantly surrounded by people, you may never notice what's happening. Solitude gives you distance, and distance gives you perspective. Sometimes you need to step away from someone simply to hear your own thoughts again. You need to discover which opinions are actually yours and which ones were planted inside you by people you've spent too much time around. That's why solitude can feel uncomfortable at first. You're not just losing company, you're losing the version of yourself that existed to please that company. And rebuilding yourself is never comfortable. But eventually something changes. You become selective. You stop giving everyone access to your time. You stop explaining every boundary. You stop trying to rescue people who repeatedly hurt you. You stop confusing familiarity with loyalty. And you begin to understand a brutal truth. Not everyone deserves access to the person you're becoming. That's one of the greatest things solitude can teach you. Your time is limited. Your attention is limited. Your emotional energy is limited. So you must become selective about where you invest them. And when you finally understand this, being alone doesn't scare you anymore. You can walk away, you can start over. You can sit in an empty room and still feel complete because you've built something inside yourself that no crowd can give you, self-respect. And once you have that, you become much harder to control because the person who can enjoy their own company doesn't desperately negotiate for a place in someone else's life. They know that if the door closes, they can build another one. And sometimes the most important person you meet during your period of solitude is yourself.